So you can sit for the reading. Thank you. All right, Revelation 2, commencing at verse 12. To the angel of the church in Pergamum, write, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. Yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city, where Satan lives. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword and of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. And this is the word of the Lord.
Today we are going to be continuing our little journey and exploration of those churches in Revelation with Pergamum. This is the title of today's sermon, You Don't Know What You Don't Know, and Pergamum is a great focus point to analyse what that even means. Alright, so book your flight tickets, pack your luggage. We're going on a little bit of a flight overseas to Pergamum in the 19th century. 96th CE. AD for the old schoolers. This is a beautiful little location in the world. It's 26 kilometres from the modern coastline of the Aegean Sea, northwest of what would become modern Turkey. It's not very coastal though, despite being so close to the sea. It's got a big mountain range that kind of blocks off the sea wind breeze. So it's actually not a very good space for trade and resources to be funneled through. It's actually a pretty shocking spot for any trade. Despite that though, it's actually become an epicenter, and that has to do with its history going on. You see, Pergamum wasn't actually important for those trade reasons up until an independent kingdom of Attalus actually took over after Alexander the Great and started lifting it up. It became then, when it was gifted to Rome in the 133 BC, basically the capital of the Roman province in Asia. So you have this little backwater city that wasn't very strategic, suddenly lifted up, and now it's a big hubbub of a place. It's actually got one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world. 200,000 parchments are in this library of Pergamum. So many parchments. And fun fact, the word parchment is actually derived from Pergamum. It's a kind of a play into it. It's derived from it. Sure, it's not as big a library as the great Alexander's library, which is 400,000 parchments, but in the ancient world, this is one of the greats. There's a lot of knowledge and lots of views and thoughts going on in that place. It's also a big hustle and bustle sphere for religious organizations and groups and mobs and all that kind of stuff. It's a big, diverse culture thing going on. It's a hot pot of all these different competing views of what truth means. It's a big whirlwind of that going on. So it was an epicenter for where people would come from far and wide to be healed by the god Asclepius. And Zeus, Dionysus, and Athene all had very prominent temples in the city. And also, a very noteworthy temple that was going on was Caesar worship. That's basically devotion to the emperor. In fact, Pergamum was one of the first cities to get on board with emperor worship. You know, the God's vessel in this world is the emperor, and they held the Caesar up in reverence. It was 29 BC, which is well ahead of some of the other Caesar worshippers that would come to follow later. This is important to note for exactly that reason. What is truth in the world of Pergamum? Is it devotion to Caesar, or is it devotion to this kind of on the margins Christ-like church that's happening? There's this whole hotpotch going on, and John clearly doesn't think very highly of this place. He has a pretty scathing review regarding it as like Devil's Throne kind of stuff, which is pretty intense language. Maybe he got kicked out of the library or something. I don't know. But there's a lot going on in this city. And when truth is kind of dispersed and lots of people are claiming truth, how do you engage with that? How do you go through those paths? And the church, to its credit, this church gets a lot of affirmation from John as well. So John has a lot of good things to say as well, like highlighting that I know where you live, I know that you're dwelling in this place, and despite that, you guys are holding true. He's giving affirmations. He's even referencing Antipas, which, according to tradition, for his devotion, he was seeing it through to even getting roasted alive in a bronze bull, which is pretty extreme. We love our martyrs in the Christian church. And he's one of the big ones. So it kind of has this emphasis point, because these people are living in this place. The verb katoikes, which is translated as live here, isn't just like a passing through kind of, this is where they live, this is where they have to deal with the challenges, this is where they're grappling with what it means to be in a very diverse community, which is also beautiful, but also has a lot of challenges, especially when there's lots of competing narratives. And how do you engage with that space? He does go on to then emphasize some of the areas that he thinks needs growth, some of the challenges this community is facing, and some of their kind of slipping and slopping around a little bit. And he really wants to emphasize and nut down into that a little bit. He highlights some of their patterns of worshipping idols that are starting to arise in their food practices, and even the sexual morality. That's heavily tied at that time as well to a lot of idol temple worship stuff. So you have like temple prostitutes for fertility, for example. And of course the food one goes without saying. That's like, sacrifice to idols. John's not a fan of that. Paul is a little bit more lenient sometimes. He's a bit like, if you don't know, no harm down, no foul. John's like, he's very much to that regard. So he kind of starts to highlight that, guys, I'm just going to point this out to you. This is what's going on. This is the path that I see is happening in your guys' lives. And how do you then move forward in that space? So this is something that the people might not have actually even been aware of. It might have just been habits that were formed, habits that they were falling into. They might not have been fully aware until John kind of started tackling into those issues. Because you don't know what you don't know. We all have our blind spots. We all have our blinkers. We all have areas of our life that, until it's pointed out to us, we kind of have on the margins. It's kind of in our peripheral, but we don't really note it. Maybe some of them were aware that what they were doing was kind of getting into weird territory. Or maybe there was plenty that were just like, yeah, this is just how we do life here. It's a hotpotch. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this community. And John's trying to really help them kind of steer into the paths a little bit and kind of start to get back on track, especially when you're in such a challenging space of when the allure of complacency and allure of some of the idols, and idols, even in the modern context, doesn't necessarily have to be in the religious sense either. We have plenty of idols, whether it come from money or greed or selfishness. It could be idols of the heart. And this is something that John really, really wants to tackle because it's becoming quite an issue within this community. There's actually a story from the Old Testament that could be fun to kind of play around with, to kind of get on the same... It's in the same vein of what John is trying to communicate to this church. And that is the story. It's a bit of a weird story. It's one of my favorites in the terms of the weird department. It involves like a talking donkey and and an angel doing one of these with a sword. It's not even the weirdest though. I had to give that to the Elisha is Elisha's successor, Elisha, when he's cold bowled by some kids and he gets some she-bears to go eat the kids. That's a weird story. But even in those ones, there's some cool little nuggets of wisdom, even in the really weird ones. Even the talking donkey one, which I'm going to nail into now. Because the talking donkey one is the Balaam story. Does anyone know Balaam? Who's heard of Balaam before? Oh, cool, it's a fresh one. There's one. Okay, so Balaam has a pet donkey. And it's his companion that's helped him to get from point A to point B to all these checkpoints throughout his travels through the donkey's lifespan. And Balaam is on a bit of a trajectory that's not very healthy or helpful. He's actually decided that he's going to take up an offer to meet with some Moabite officials, and it's got an incentive of some greedy, profit-driven desire that's going to sell out the Israelites a little bit. So, he's on his way, he's saddled up his donkey, he's getting it all prepped for the road trip, and he's hopped on and he's starting to do this little adventure. But God decides, you sell it out to the Israelites, you're doing this for greed, I've got to send an angel to oppose you. And there's an angel that rocks up, and he's just hanging out on the road with his sword ready. When he comes through, he's going to give him a good what for. And the donkey starts to approach. He notices up ahead, the donkey does. Balaam, completely oblivious. Donkey notices, there's an angel with a sword going to flail around a little bit. I'm going to start doing a bit of a detour. So the donkey starts going off track and starts going to its ride, and it starts waddling off into the scrub a little bit. Balaam, not a fan of that. He starts whacking the donkey. Call the RSPCA. He's got his staff, giving it a good knocking. And the donkey kind of starts to veer back onto track. Fine, okay, we'll start tracking on back in. But they miss the angel. They manage to just maneuver. Balaam's furious at his donkey, but just once, it's no foul. Would have been fine the rest of the journey had it not been for the second time round. Now they're going through a vineyard, and the angel has once again teed himself up, and he's got his sword ready, and he's just kind of doing one of these. The donkey's like, I'm going to give this guy a bit of a wide berth. So he starts to kind of do his little detour around, but there's a wall on one of the sides. And to do so, to just squeeze past the angel, he kind of crushes Balaam's foot a little bit against this wall. Now Balaam, he's furious at that. He's like, what are you doing, you dumb donkey? You just crushed my foot. Totally missing the angel doing one of these ones, just winding up. He manages to just squeeze past. Balaam, not very thankful, starts beating his donkey again. Again, RSPCA, animals' rights need to be addressed here, but Balaam is not happy, is the main emphasis point of that. He doesn't recognize the angel. He hasn't seen the angel. The donkey, totally clued on. Safe travels the rest of the way, correct? Well, again, angel decides, okay, well, now I'm going to figure out a spot where I'm going to be able to just perfectly situate myself. There's going to be no wiggle room for this donkey to move past. It's found a very narrow strip of walls on either side and vineyards. It's a very narrow strip. There's not enough room for the donkey to go this way, that way, or jump over it, or go under it. There's no maneuvering this time. So the donkey gets closer and closer and closer and closer, and eventually just sits down. It won't go any further. There's no way forward here. And Balaam, he gets off his donkey. He's getting furious. He's giving it a good kick. He's like, what are you doing, you dumb donkey? This is what the path is. You keep going. And he gets out his stick, he beats his donkey, but then the Lord, he works through the donkey, I guess, and the donkey is granted the ability to speak into this situation. That's a bit fun. It's like Dr. Dolittle here. The donkey retorts, what have I done to make you beat me 3 times? You know, we see the little raised eyebrow happening here. Now, Balaam, in this story, he just seems to take this as it goes. He doesn't respond with shock that the donkey's talking to him. He just kind of like, oh yeah, this is happening now. I'm going to have a good word to this donkey now that it's speaking to me. He gives it a mouthful of like, you have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword instead of this staff, I would have really given you what for. Oh, how grateful is this guy? And he's getting ready. He's giving him a mouthful. The donkey kind of emphasizes, man, I've been loyal in taking you here and there, and my track record has been pretty reliable, correct? And you know what Balaam says? Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're right. No. He just says no. Balaam's like, no, you have not been reliable. You have been a trash donkey. I'm going to sell you off the second I'm just done with you. It is at that point, though, that Balaam has a bit of a revelation. He gets granted, I guess, the ability to see the angel standing in front of him. And God grants him this sight and this perspective, and suddenly it all comes clear to him, and his eyes widen as this like angel's still doing one of these ones waiting for him to go through. And he falls to his knees on his face, and he's just realizing like, oh crud, I done stuffed up. This donkey clearly had a vantage point that I wasn't even taking note of before. He's on his knees, he's repenting, he's like crying out to the Lord, I have really stuffed up this time. The donkey in this story is the one that was wiser than Balaam, the man in this story. It had a vantage point that was being missed, a perspective, an input that was being disregarded, a perspective that was different, which helped actually save this dude's life in a way. This is crazy, right? So nuggets of wisdom and even these weird stories. It's a beautiful story of where sometimes the voice of truth into a situation can come from very unlikely spaces. It can come from very unlikely positions. And that's kind of the way that truth can kind of operate. It can be dangerous sometimes winding through some of these paths. And that's where we need to really engage with one another sometimes, to see other perspectives and other points of view, which God might be working through. There might be a thing that's occurring that is completely out of my line of sight. But God's working to kind of bring light into those spaces. Sometimes that needs a bit of work. And that's kind of what's happening with John here, as he's kind of enlightening this church to some of these things they might not be even aware of. Again, you don't know what you don't know. Thankfully, the donkey was wise enough to assist in this situation, because it was revealed that had the donkey continued, the donkey would have been fine. Like, the donkey wouldn't have got what's coming to it from the angel. No, that was Balaam's deal. But the donkey, regardless, even though it was getting whacked, still was looking out for its rider. He was still looking out. That seems to be what's happening with John. Arguably, we can play around with this story and the analogies that can be drawn from it. Like Jesus in his day, all his warning, like as the donkey was warning the religious leaders of the time around the destruction of the temple if they continued going down this line of trajectory. And lo and behold, he was correct, and the temple would eventually fall. You have plenty of prophets that fill that same position as the donkey. You can make even parallels with contemporary, like the crew of the Messebar ship radioing into the Titanic to warn of icebergs not really being heated. And arguably, even today in the modern context, arguably scientists warning about climate change happening, warning about these trajectories. And some people too high, like politicians and that can be a bit high and mighty sometimes. There's a lot of competing voices. And sifting through requires an open heart to find where God's moving through some of these thoughts and perspectives. It can be a muddled mess sometimes. Truth can, in such a world of competing voices, requires an open heart, but also discernment to navigate. To be completely honest, there's plenty of aspects, like even just the Christian label doesn't necessarily default make everything correct. that people are doing. Like, this church is a good example, and there's plenty of historical record within the Christian church's timeline that has been quite flailing around, if I'm honest, where we've needed to really take a good hard look at ourselves and try to discern where the truth is in the matter. And where the truth is, it can be challenging. And the monopoly of the truth is hard to kind of sift through sometimes. But I think that's kind of the point. I would even argue a case that sometimes other groups that haven't necessarily been Christian have sometimes acted more Christ-like in situations. And that's something to work on. There's plenty of areas of discernment and navigating what truth when it's been used, like, God's name to justify things like slavery, exploitation, imperialism. There's a lot of sifting through that needs to happen to find out where God's moving. The waters can be quite muddy. The Pergamum church is such a great example of that and highlights that concern, even though such a faithful community that's going on here, such a faithful community, yet still is slipping into these idolatry practices and practices that are not bringing life to others around them. One of my favorite kind of concepts and quotes, I'm actually going to rip off of a guy named John Macquarie. I'm going to quote John Macquarie, just in the idea of truth. And this is how it goes. John Macquarie, the voice of God is a quiet and elusive one. We do right to be hesitant when either we ourselves or others think that the voice has been heard. We must be suspicious of those who are too forward in claiming to know what God is saying in our times or doing in the world today. Churchmen and even statesmen who claim to be familiar with the counsels of God and with his plans of action in the world are a dangerous breed. That's poignant to me, because sometimes it highlights to me that sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't necessarily the most truthful voice in the room. That's something that needs to be discerned and worked through. Sometimes the loudest voice, and it doesn't necessarily mean that speaking up is by inherently bad either. Like, it doesn't say that speaking up into a position, into a space, is necessarily wrong either. But sometimes the voice of God is that kind of like in the community that was going on in Pergamum. The Christian church was like a tiny minority thing. If we were to go with the might makes right and the loudest voice wins, then Caesar would still be worshipped, right? Caesar was the loud voice in that space. Caesar was, in that worldview then, correct. It requires discernment. It's not necessarily the loudest voice that is correct. And that's where attention needs to be drawn to those details of where God's moving. Because God's name has been used to justify some horrendous things, which breaks my heart. When you have like the Caesar worshipper and that kind of stuff being so loud in that community and really getting there. And even today, when you have like some megachurch people justifying $65 million on a jet and raking it out from their church community, that seems like a mismatch to me. I don't know if that's the truth. And that's why we need to sift through it and determine some of these loud voices. The Christian voice in that community can be a humbled one. It's a humbled one. And especially in especially in this community, it's one it's not the centerfold, but it's resonating this new way of bringing life as they sort out this nature of God. Sometimes truth can come through a donkey. That's beautiful. Nice, let's lead into communion. I'm not going to lie. I didn't prep a communion talk, but I kind of felt inspired on the way here, thinking about, I guess, the donkeys of the world and the Balaams of the world. And I was thinking around the table of Jesus, and I was thinking of a Balaam in the form of Judas, who also partook of the meal. Judas gets a bit of a bad rap in Christian tradition. He's kind of, in many areas, been kind of demonized as the antagonist. Sometimes, I must admit, I kind of empathize to a degree with Judas, which is weird because he's often labeled as just the antagonist, the villain of the story. But I think to villainize him and detach him kind of puts him at arm's length and says we won't slip into that kind of betrayal. I don't know. Judas, the story of Judas to me isn't one of Jesus giving up on Judas. It's a story of Judas giving up on Judas, which I think is way more heartbreaking. And even around, like, he was essentially the vision of Balaam whacking the donkey, not knowing the trajectory that the donkey was swerving him and maneuvering him around with. There's a lot of theologians that argue that Judas was likely a zealot, in that his expectation of Jesus was that he was going to be a military overlord and overthrow Rome, and everything was going to be hunky-dory. And Jesus wasn't fitting that mold. The donkey wasn't fitting that mold. And so he kept trying to whack it back onto place, but Jesus was doing Jesus. He was just like, no, I'm going to keep doing this. And it comes to the Last Supper, and by that point, Judas is prepared to sell out his donkey. This is Judas with the sword, ready to slash at his donkey, not recognizing what Jesus is actually doing for the community and the people. I think we've all kind of been the Balaam at some point, or the Judas. You know, Peter, he also, denied Christ. One we made the Pope, one we demonized. Judas's heart was completely broken after the fact of the matter, and he realized what he had done. It dawned on him. He threw the money back. He was like, I don't want this blood money. They wouldn't accept it back. That was now blood money. That was tainted. Judas died a broken man, which is heartbreaking. But it's not a story of, again, Jesus giving up on Judas. Even to the end, it was Judas giving up on Judas. And he partook in the meal as well. And we can learn. We can learn from Judas and his very human story about the human condition. And sometimes how we can kind of be conflicted with what is the truth. Judas started having his perspective of what the truth was. Unfortunately, it was unaligned. But, Peter, he gives a great example. He became one of the first religious leaders to really start to nail into it. He also denied Jesus. So there's stories of how you can then respond after the fact. It's not the conclusion. After Peter denied 3 times, he wasn't then cast out to the side. He was brought in and made like a central figure and restored and healing. And that's what this meal really represents. An opportunity for healing, of new life. And that's beautiful. I'd love to invite you up and grab when you're ready.